So this happened sometime, I guess maybe 2013 or something. But to give it a long story short, this took place when I was about maybe 14 or 15 years old. Now, back in my old neighborhood, I lived next door to a woman who happened to be not very nice. She was definitely what my mom would call her, the Antichrist. That's basically how she put it. To make it a long story short, she basically Lee was sitting there and doing some pretty messed up things towards me and my mom. One of them being whatever toy was thrown outside or out of the yard and land in her yard, she keeps it. I don't even know if it was that she keeps it just for whatever reason or she throws it in the trash. I unfortunately will never know that for the full-on fact, and it honestly makes me wonder. Now, the neighbor at the time, we'll call her Darcy. Darcy was a real piece of work, and she was definitely someone that I had no idea she would become this really an antichrist. She gave my mom a hard time, and most of the time, she never really cared about anybody. In fact, a couple of people on my street had issues and problems with her as well, and they ended up telling me their experiences. However, though, one of the times that she was at their house, she one time spray painted someone's door with nasty profanity words and nasty racist words as well. I don't even know much about it until they told me and my mom about it. It was until maybe sometime in the summer of 2013 when she blocked my mom's driveway when she was trying to back in when my mom was coming home. My mom ended up honking her horn one time and ended up screaming at her, but however, she ended up just backing out and backing in as usual. But then Darcy just sat there. She didn't even move or anything. She was scared to come out because she knew my mom was going to scream the living crap out of her for blocking the way and etc. I just stayed in the car. I didn't even know why Darcy would choose that area, but it's honestly started to get really messed up. I stayed there for at least a little while in the car with my mom when my mom told me and my brother just to take our stuff and go inside the house and that she'd be there. We did that, and my mom followed up, I guess, 5 minutes afterwards. Now, this took place, and then this happened, then something like that, and then another issue with Darcy appeared again. This time, my brother, and I were just playing in the backyard on our fort, the play fort with the equipment, that kind of thing. As we were playing, my brother and I were just sliding down the slide being crazy in the summer. Of course, we made it a water slide since we put a hose there. Darcy comes out for whatever reason and screams something towards me and my brother that we didn't know. I didn't even know if it was pure gibberish or not, but my mom immediately came out since she was in the kitchen. And when she came outside just to check on me and my brother, she heard Darcy. She ended up screaming at Darcy and telling her that she was calling the cops and told me and my brother to come inside. My brother and I came back inside and we ended up playing video games or something just to take our mind off of what just happened. Eventually, though, it was at least a year later when we hadn't seen Darcy in a while. Her car wasn't even there. It was strange because I never saw her, and I ended up asking my mom what happened to her. As soon as I asked my mom about her, she said that the police were there the next night after she screamed at her over screaming gibberish or whatever at me and my brother. The cops came over and gave her some warnings from other neighbors saying not to bother them, and she hadn't. I was later found out that she ended up moving out of that house, and the house was being renovated by other people to be put on sale. I'm just glad that Darcy didn't do anything, drastic like coming over to someone's house and killing them. But I also wondered where she is now. Although I don't really care what happens to her, I'm just hoping she gets the help that she needs. Something is definitely up with that woman. Now, all the time, whenever my mom tells me a story about how neighbors, or even tell her friends about it, she'd always refer to Darcy as the Antichrist, and is going to still do that to this day. So this happened to Alex back in 2016, and this is when he, along with his friend Michelle, or girlfriend Michelle, were living at this house at the time, at a certain house at the time back when they were used to live in Michigan. Now, to cut to the chase, Alex and Michelle have been dating for about a couple months now, or at least a year of seeing each other. They decided to live in this pretty decent house in Michigan. The neighbors were pretty decent, although I won't mention the city, but I do know it's not located in Detroit. Alex, along with Michelle, got used to this one neighbor who was living next door. His name was Roddy. Roddy was pretty much around Alex's age, and he was medium built, but he seemed to be a decent guy. Roddy would come over to his house every now and then and chat with him, see how he's doing, that kind of guy stuff. However, something really strange got on with Roddy about maybe 2 months of living in that house in the same neighborhood that Roddy lived in. For starters, Roddy would constantly come over and ask to borrow stuff. The weirdest thing he's ever asked Michelle, along with Alex, to borrow was some tampons. Now, honestly, that's girl stuff, but it was kind of weird, but an odd request. But at first, they assumed that Roddy probably had a guy problems with his girlfriend or something, or maybe he was just living with someone who happened to be on those cycles. It was a strange request, but Alex and Michelle still did what they had to do, was to be a good neighbor. However, it wasn't until maybe 2 weeks later when Roddy all of a sudden came over when Alex was home alone. Now, to cut to the chase, Alex was basically home alone while Michelle was at work that night. As he was just, putting away the dishes, he ended up hearing a knock at the door, and it turns out to be Roddy. Roddy ended up asking Alex if he could come over to his place, saying that he wants to film something for a YouTube video. At first, that's what Alex thought, that maybe he was a YouTuber, so he was about to go and follow him. But as soon as they approached the house next door, that's when, honestly, Alex had something really fishy. There seemed to be a big black van, and it seemed like there might have been maybe more than one person in there. Of course, Alex said that he forgot something and asked Roddy to wait for him for a bit. When Roddy got in, he closed and locked the door and then called 911. After explaining the situation, he ended up staying up in the bedroom for a little while until the cops arrived. About 15 minutes later, the cops arrived and they arrested Roddy. It turns out that Roddy's been known to lure people into his house in neighborhoods, and he had been stealing people's money, such as wallets and that. Now, still to this day, Alex is glad that he did not follow Roddy in that house, because if he did, then there was a chance all those people in that van would have pretty much robbed Roddy, along with Roddy, would have robbed Alex out of his money. Roddy was no longer living in that house, and they ended up moving at least a few months later, as Michelle, along with Alex, couldn't stand the constant paranoia of Roddy watching them. It still hurts to this day and wonder what could have happened to Alex if he had followed Roddy into his own house. It honestly frightens them to this day, knowing that something horrible could have potentially happened to Roddy, Dee's neighbor Alex, if Alex had set foot in there. This happened to a teacher, which we'll call him by the name of Derek. Now, Derek was pretty much a pretty cool guy, although he was a pretty good math teacher. There was this one neighbor he was living at that happened to be a pretty weird guy. His name was Terry, and he seemed to be pretty decent. However, though, Derek, being the math teacher he was honestly getting a bit suspicious with this Terry guy. This Terry guy seemed to be out there almost every day, and he seemed to wave at him. At first, he didn't really seem to mind that, as a lot of neighbors do tend to wave at him and see how he's doing. However, this is when it got really weird with this Terry guy. This Terry guy, however, was still in his house all night, and it was honestly getting strange since he didn't see him outside late at night. But however, though, Derek ended up going into his house for the night. That's when he ended up hearing what seemed to be like screaming coming from Terry's house. Honestly, Terry ended up doing something, or some murder or something might have taken place. But the very strange thing is that there was no cars in the driveway. This honestly confuses everybody, since he didn't even know why there was no one there. However, that's when Derek ended up going over to Roddy's place and knocked on the door, wondering if everything was okay. As he knocked, he waited for a few minutes, but there was no response. Something honestly was going on, and it didn't seem like anything was right. Of course, that's when Derek ended up going back to his house and calling the police. Of course, the police came over to take his statement, and they went over to the house where Terry was living in and heard screaming. It turns out that there was no one living in that house. But the strangest thing is that house was vacant for years, and nobody was supposed to be living in there, and it was due for a renovation. However, Terry must have been living there illegally, although there was no evidence that if he left or not. That honestly still confuses Derek to this day, if Terry was really living there. And about that scream, who was actually in that house with Terry? This still gives Derek shivers to this day, and he even thinks more about his conclusions of what could have happened. There could have been a kidnapping or something much worse. That is one question that Derek does not want to find out. He's got 2 kids, and he's living at a pretty decent neighborhood away from his old one, as he didn't really trust that if someone else was living in that house, that vacant house, if he does not know if Terry still lived there or not, but he doesn't clearly want to know. Something did say that something was going on to this day, and of course, we can definitely say that Derek is not returning to find out. So, this was about 14 years ago, but however, this happened been sometime, I guess you could say, in the late 2000s. Now, this happened to a friend of mine who used to live next door to one of my friends, Laura. His name at the time, we'll call him Harrison. Harrison was living with his brother in a pretty decent house in pretty much in a rural area where some houses were surrounded by trees and etc. Harrison, along with his brother, had been living at this one beautiful, decent, huge house for about a few years now. Of course, Harrison has his girlfriend living with him, as well as his brother has his girlfriend. So they basically live in and share a pretty big size house. Most of the expenses have been paid off as they always kept on top of bills, and they have pretty decent high paying jobs, so they were able to keep the house going for as long as they could. However, though, there was a one house that honestly they have rode their bikes past, but they didn't really know who was living in that house. The house was located in a pretty secluded area, and it honestly got them wondering why was there a house still there. Now, to keep a pretty good low profile, though, Harrison, along with his brother, have passed by this house that was maybe about a couple blocks away from where they were living at. Now, this house actually, it looked pretty decently kept. However, there was this dog who happened to be a saddleback German Shepherd. He was friendly, so that's when Harrison, along with his brother, were petting the dog. A neighbor came out, and it happened to be, they thought that it was the owner, and just as they were about to back away, the owner smiled and said, "It's okay, you can pet the dog, I don't mind," he said. He seemed to be pretty content with it and keep up with its confidence. That's when Harrison and his brother started petting the dog, and they started getting comfortable with it. However, as they were petting the dog, they all of a sudden looked up to see that the owner happened to be maybe in his early 40s. He seemed to be pretty decently kept, and he said that his wife and him had divorced about 3 years ago, and he had somehow kept the house with a certain bribe that he bribed his wife with. Now, they honestly didn't really care about that, but a couple times they went over at the house and ended up petting the neighbor's dog on their way to and from work. However, though, there was one day where the dog or the neighbor weren't out in their house. They honestly had no idea what was happening, so they ended up leaving at that. However, though, it wasn't until maybe a week or so later when they ended up getting a knock on their door. Harrison and his brother walked up and realized that it was a police officer. They ended up opening the door, and the police officer ended up explaining to them about a man who had somehow had a German Shepherd outside. It turned out it was the exact same man that they had been seeing. Well, it turned out that the man had been known to hurt animals, and he had been mistreating the German Shepherd. The German Shepherd was eventually taken off of the guy's hands, and he's been put on probation from ever owning an animal. It's later turned out that that man that they had been seeing to and from work while petting the dog was known to be a very suspicious guy, keeping pretty much really messed up content that was illegal for the public to see. He honestly had a history of kidnapping anyone, stealing money, and even robbing their pets. It turns out that there were a couple dead pets inside the basement and dead in bodies that are being wrapped in garbage bags. The man was eventually arrested, but that dog they brought him to them and asked Harrison and his brother if they want the dog. They do, and they ended up keeping the dog. However, the man that did own him was arrested. There was no traces on if he did this to other people before they met him or not. But safe to say, Harrison and his brother had never seen that man again, and they're grateful that they keep the German Shepherd. Although he did pass away from cancer in sometime like at least 3 or 4 years later. The German Shepherd was about 6 years old when they got him, and his name was Roger. He was a very sweet shepherd. Harrison, along with his brother, have had their girlfriends been together still, and they do have children of their own. They are now living in a safer neighborhood, and nothing like that has ever happened since then, and they hope it stays that way.